I created a spooky cemetery scene rendered in Unreal Engine 5. Let me show you how. This project can be broken down into several parts: previs, blockout and lighting, modeling, sequencer animation, and finally, rendering and editing. I'll go through each of these sections in the order that they were completed. The very first thing I did in this scene was to create my terrain and a basic blockout of the level using BSP cubes for the assets I would model later on. For the landscape, I used a height map from Motion Forge Pictures to give my scene some hills and valleys, as well as block out the horizon from view. From here, I used the Megascan's European asset pack to paint the first pass of the major elements of the foliage in the landscape. Only the largest trees were placed at this stage to frame the scene without tanking performance too early in the project. From there, it was time to set up the camera, which is one of my favorite parts. I used a Cinecamera actor so that I could have the most cinematic control over my scene. The most important things to note about these camera settings are the film back choice and the focal length. 16:9 DSLR provides a clear image even at night due to the large sensor, and the 85mm lens has a sort of flattening effect that in my mind is synonymous with filmic presentation. Additionally, I set the aspect ratio to the classic anamorphic widescreen format used in film to get those black bars across the top and bottom. For reference, that's 2.39 by 1 aspect ratio. The only post-processing effects I used in-engine were some very minor chromatic aberration and film grain, which admittedly I went a little too far with. The reason I used so few post-effects is because I had planned from the beginning to take my render from Unreal into DaVinci Resolve later for compositing, and I didn't want my image to be too degraded before that point in the process. With the camera set, I needed to get it to move through the scene, so I used a Cinecamera rig rail actor to do so. In Unreal 5.3, rig rails have been updated with drive modes that allow you to choose how your rail is operated. There are modes for uniform speed, keyframing, or duration-based rail movements, essentially choosing how your camera or whatever you have attached to your rig rail moves from one end to the other. I started with uniform speed as this was helpful for the previs of my shot in the viewport, but eventually I would switch to manually keyframe the movement in sequencer. We'll get to that in a little bit. From the start, my vision for the scene was to be at night. Now, night lighting is often portrayed in film, TV, and games as blue, even if that's not necessarily the case in real life. Now, based on my vision for the scene, I knew that I wanted to go a different route and chose to make my directional light a green hue to complement the green of the ghost orbs I would make later. From there, I used an exponential height fog actor to allow light to scatter nicely in the scene. I kept this fog its default white color, as the hue of the directional light would be doing most of the color grading for me, and I would do more color grading in post later on. Eventually, I found that while the volumetric fog was good for lighting the scene in the way that I wanted, it wasn't nearly as dense or layered as I would have liked. So I made 3 fog cards stacked at different angles and distances to give my fog more depth. One thing I noticed after completing the render is that the fog cards are set to cast shadow, which blocks light passing through some of the trees in the foreground. This mistake unfortunately cost me some dramatic lighting, but thankfully that's about it. The results are extremely subtle, but it does make a positive difference on the overall presentation, even with that slight lighting mistake I mentioned. In order to be as efficient as possible with this project, I needed to be intentional about what models I wanted to make from scratch and how detailed each of those models should be, as this would arguably be the most time-consuming part. I had planned for 3 different model types: fences, headstones, and a full skeleton. I managed to create all 3 types of models at varying poly counts and texture fidelity based on how each asset would be used in the scene. The highest poly of the assets is the focal point of the scene, the headstone. I modeled this headstone in Maya using subdivision poly modeling and textured in Substance Painter. The other headstone is intentionally very low poly and untextured, as it's only intended to be used silhouetted in the background of the scene. I modeled this again using polymodeling and Boolean workflow. These were scattered at various angles and distances along the landscape using the foliage system. The next asset I created was this ornate fence and a low stone wall. This would be in the foreground and use extremely close to the camera, so it too has detailed texturing, modeled in Maya using subdivision workflow. The last model I created was this skeleton arm, Originally, I wanted to create a full skeleton, as I mentioned, rigged and animated, but as it turns out, there's a lot of bones in the human body, and it quickly started to spiral out of scope for the time frame I was locked to. I pivoted to only modeling a low poly bone arm, which allowed me to spend more time on the sound effects later at the cost of the animation here looking just a little bit stiff. I'm not going to talk about every aspect of my sequencer animations here, but there are some interesting topics to mention. First of all, camera shake was created using the following settings and animated using keyframes. I found that the purlin noise gave me the most natural looking wobbles, and that the fade in and out times needed to be relatively low for the number of frames I had in my total sequence. Additionally, as I mentioned, I pivoted away from a full animated skeleton, so to save time and to make life easy, I instead keyframed the arm to pop out of the ground using its transform properties, and adjusted the camera as needed to make sure it was somewhat believable. It certainly isn't perfect, and I think the fact that it's only on screen for a quarter of a second helps sell the bit. As you can see, it doesn't just snap out of the ground and lock into place. I hope to make the static mesh feel more alive, so I made adjustments using the sequencer curves to make sure the keyframes didn't feel too sterile. Additionally, you can see the particle effect for a blast of dirt as the bones leave the earth. I did this with two emitter types in a Niagara system. One was a directional burst and the other was a confetti emitter. I used the confetti for the larger pieces and the directional burst for transparent clouds. Both utilized 2D sprites. While we're on the topic of custom particle effects, the ghost orb was also animated using the sequencer. Normally, to move an object along a path like that, you might make that object the child of a spline and animate its position along the length of a spline, but that's too complicated and I just needed this done fast, so instead I just used a second camera rig rail. A camera rig rail's purpose is to move a camera around the scene, so there's nothing stopping you from just placing any old actor on your camera rig rail and moving it the same way. Unlike a real rig rail, Unreal's rails can be bent and manipulated to any shape, as well as hidden from the scene. So I was able to make a winding, floating path that my ghost orb could animate along, using the automatic drive modes of the rig rails. With the sequence complete, it was time to populate the scene with the full set of assets that I had made and fill out the landscape with more foliage. Once again, I used the Megascan's European Asset Pack. I used grasses, twigs, stones, stumps, boulders, and all that good stuff to make my scene feel as woodsy as possible without really cluttering the sequence that I had started with. Doing this in as late a stage as I did allowed my scene to not be too busy while I was working earlier on. It also kept my editor performance up and allowed me to intentionally choose artistically beneficial foliage, as I was confident that the rest of my scene wouldn't be significantly changing from this point on. I rendered my frames through the sequence renderer in Unreal as an image sequence of JPEGs with 8-bit color depth, and all 1080 frames were sent to DaVinci Resolve for the final step. Moving over to DaVinci Resolve now, as you can see, most of the editing effort went into the audio. There's low rumbles when you're passing by or through objects. There's an ethereal wind that tracks the ghost orb through the frame and pans the audio to match. There's sound effects for the dirt cloud at the end, alongside the horror tension build-up and releases. I won't go into too much more detail here, but just know that the sound, stereo width, timing, volume, and more were all adjusted in some way in DaVinci Resolve. Additionally, all sound effects for this were purchased from Pond5 or downloaded from Pixabay royalty-free. The very last thing I'll mention is the effects on the video itself, on the render that I got from Unreal. As mentioned previously, I wanted to hold off on degrading the image too far in Unreal because I could do it better in DaVinci. I used a video effect called Film Damage to add lens dirt, take color grading further, and sell the creepy filmic qualities of the sequence. Thank you so much for watching the Behind Closed Pixels breakdown of the Spooky Cemetery render that I made. Appreciate you making it this far into the video. If you enjoyed it, please do like and share it to somebody else. That's the biggest help that you can do, is to send this video to one more person, so that one more person can see it. It means a lot. So, with that, thanks for being here. Have a good day. Be good to each other.